section today, section 7-5, and the learning target is I can factor a quadratic trinomial into two binomials. This whole unit of factoring really deals with one of the main ways that we solve quadratic equations coming in our next topic. So in the notes, and I know that today's notes were pretty heavy, and the lesson in this video is actually pretty long too, but the good news is that you don't have a video or notes for the rest of the week. You're just going to be really practicing how to factor a trinomial into two binomials. And in the notes, it was broken up into 4 different types, just to kind of help you organize the way that you want to look at how you're going to be factoring these. So type 1 is when we have it as x squared plus bx plus c, where b and c are both positive. This is the easiest one to do because I know that when I have a positive middle term and when I have a positive last term, that I can already set up my binomials this way. And because this is just y squared, I know that it's going to be y here and y here, okay? And because both of these are positive, I also know it's going to be plus something and plus something. That's why it's the more simple of the 4 types. So then I just need to think to myself, this c term, or this constant term at the end, what are the factor pairs that make up 8? And I'm going to list them out here on the right-hand side. So I know that 1 times 8 is 8. I know that 2 times 4 is 8. And the way that I'm going to select the right pair is these 2 factor pairs need to add up to that middle term. So 1 plus 8 is 9, and 2 plus 4 is 6. And my middle term is 6. So I know that this pair right here, 2 and 4, are going to be the pair that goes in my binomial. And it doesn't matter which one I write first or second. So I'm going to write y plus 2, y plus 4. Now, we want to double check. You can do a mental check. I'm going to do it on the whiteboard, but this is something you can do mentally to see if does this set of binomials, when I distribute everything out or use FOIL, turn into this trinomial. Because remember, when we're factoring a trinomial, we are basically doing the opposite of what we've been doing. We're undoing FOIL, okay? So let's go ahead and multiply this out and see if it ends up being this trinomial. So first, y times y is y squared. Outside, 4 times y is 4y. Inside, 2 times y is 2y. Last, 2 times 4 is 8. When I add my like terms in the middle, I get y squared plus 6y plus 8. So this works. This is the correct answer for this. So what I would like for you to do is I'd like for you to try these 2. This is for type 1. Write them down, pause the video, and see how you do. So again, I've got positive and positive, so I know I can set my binomials up like this. It's going to be x plus something and x plus something. And then I'm going to look at 32, and I'm going to look at what are my factor pairs of 32. Well, 1 times 32 is 32. Oh, look, 8 times 4 is 32. And when I add those together, that makes 12 in the center there. So 8, or x plus 8 and x plus 4 would be the correct combination. Now let's move down to here. Again, it's positive and positive. So my binomials are going to be set up like x plus something and x plus something. And 10, 1 times 10 is 10, 2 times 5 is 10. And when you're doing this, you're going to start getting faster, where you're going to start adding these together, looking for that combination of 7. So 2 plus 5 is 7. So that is the correct factored form of that trinomial. All right, people, here is type 2, the factoring quadratic trinomials into two binomials. So the first type was the most simple one, and it had a positive and a positive. This one is x squared minus the middle term bx plus c. So you have to be thinking to yourself, in order for this middle term to be negative and this last term to be positive, both of the numbers or both of the factors have to be negative, okay? Because a negative times a negative is a positive. So I know that my two binomials are going to end up looking like this. X minus something times x minus something, okay? So we're going to use the same strategy that we used for type 1. We are going to set up our binomials the way that we know they're going to end up. And I'm going to start listing my factor pairs. And I'm going to keep in mind that it's negative. So negative 1 times negative 20 is negative or positive 20. Okay, when I add those together, I get negative 21. So that is not negative 9. Next one, I could do negative 2 times negative 10, because when I multiply those together, I get positive 20. But when I add those, I get negative 12, which is not my middle term here. My next one, negative 4 times negative 5 is positive 20, and there's the right combo, because when I add negative 4 and negative 5, I get negative 9 in the middle. Again, I could FOIL this out. I could see, is this actually the factored form of this? So the first term, x times x, would be x squared. The outside term, negative 5 times x, is negative 5x. The inside term, negative 4x, and the last term, positive 20. And then when I combine those terms in the middle, I get x squared minus 9x plus 20. Okay? All right, so let's try a couple of this type 2. Let's double check that they both are that type. And they are, because my c term is positive and my middle term is negative. So I'm going to set my two binomials up, y at the beginning, and I'm going to start going through, and I'm thinking about all the factor pairs of 64. 1 times 64 is 64. Oh, look, 8 times 8. Negative 8 times negative 8 is positive 64. And when I add those two together, it ends up being negative 16. So that's my answer. Okay? Now, what about this one? Is this the same type? I've got a negative middle term. I've got a positive last term. Yes, it is. And my variable is z. So I'm going to set up my two binomials. I've got z and z, minus and minus. And I'm going to start looking at my factor pairs. So negative 1 times negative 24 is positive 24. But when I add those together, I get negative 25, which isn't that. Negative 2 times negative 12 is positive 24. And when I add those together, I get negative 14. There is my correct factored form. All right, people, here is our third type of quadratic trinomial that we are factoring into two binomials. You'll notice it's the same every time, it's just the signs are different. So here we have a negative c term, and we have a negative middle term or a negative b term. So you have to be thinking to yourself, well, in order to have negative, that means one of my signs is positive and one of my signs is negative. So I know that I'm going to have something set up like this, x plus something and x minus something. So the indication about which factor is going to be positive and which factor is going to be negative is you'll notice that your b term in the middle is negative, which means, and you should have taken this down in your notes, that the larger of the two factors needs to be negative. So just like in the other types, we're going to go ahead and start listing our factors for our c terms. So here's the example. X squared minus 3x minus 10. And remember, one's negative, one is positive. So I'm going to think about my factor pairs of 10. Negative 1, and well, actually the larger one needs to be negative. So negative 10 times 1 results in negative 10. But when I add those together, I get negative 9. That is not negative 3. I'm going to go on to my next factor pair of 5 and 2. I know that the larger one needs to be negative. So negative 5 times 2. When I add those together, what do I get? I get that negative 3. And I forgot to create these at the beginning, which you can do now. I'm going to start out with x, and remember it's going to be plus, then minus something. So minus 5 and plus 2. Now, if I were to FOIL this out, let's see what I get. X times x is x squared. Negative 5 times x is negative 5x. 2 times x is positive 2x. 2 times negative 5 is negative 10. When I add those middle terms, I get x squared minus 3x minus 10. All right, excellent. This is the correct factored form of this. So we're going to do a couple more examples of this third type. So go ahead and write these down and try it out. See if you get them right. Pause the video and then resume the video to see what the answer is. Okay, so we have n squared minus 2n minus 63. Again, this is still our type 3 because we've got a negative and a negative. And I know I'm going to set up my binomials like this. N plus something and n minus something. And now I'm going to start writing down my factor pairs of 63. And I also noticed that this middle term is kind of small, so those factor pairs are going to be pretty close together. So I immediately go to 7 times 9 is 63. So the middle term is negative, so that means it's negative 9 times 7. That makes negative 63. When I add those two together, I get negative 2. So I'm going to put my 9 here, and I'm going to put my 7 here. I'm good to go. All right, here's my last one. P squared minus 4p minus 12. I know I'm going to set my binomials up like this. I know I have a plus something and a minus something. Now I'm going to start going through my factor pairs. So the middle term is negative, so that means the larger factor needs to be negative. So negative 12 times 1 is negative 12, but when I add those together, I get negative 11, and that's not correct here. Then I'm going to go to my next factor pair of 6 and 2. I know the bigger one has to be negative, so negative 6 times 2 results in negative 12, and when I add them together, I get negative 4. So I'm going to go ahead and put the 6 in here and the 2 in there. If I were to multiply this out, I end up getting that trinomial right there. All right, people, here we are with type 4 of our factoring of trinomials. You'll notice that it's similar to type 3, where my C term is negative, but now my B term is positive. So just like before, when I find my factor pairs, I need a positive factor pair and a negative factor pair in order to get this negative C term. But in the differences this time, I actually need to have the larger factor pair be positive instead of like last time where it was negative. So let's look at this example here. X squared plus 3x minus 10. I know that my binomials are going to be x plus something and x minus something, just like with type 3, okay? And now I'm going to start listing my factor pairs that result in negative 10, and my larger number needs to be positive, and I'm looking for that combo that's going to add up to a positive 3x. So let's say positive 10 times negative 1, that is negative 10, but when I add those together, I get a positive 9, which is not 3x. And let's do 5 and 2, so positive 5 times negative 2 results in negative 10. And when I add those together, I get a positive 3x. So this is my correct pair. So it's going to be x plus 5 and x minus 2. If I were to FOIL this out, what would I get? Well, I would get x squared minus 2x plus 5x minus 10. When I add those two middle terms, I get x squared plus 3x minus 10, which is that trinomial. All right, so go ahead and pause the video, write these two down, try them, see if you get the right answer, and then resume the video, okay? So this first one is n squared plus n minus 6. I know I'm going to have an n plus something and an n minus something. And I know that my middle term is positive, so I'm going to start going through those factor pairs, because remember there's a 1 here. We don't write it, but it's 1n. So what two factor pairs when added together is going to make 1? Well, that's going to be 3 and negative 2, because 3 times negative 2 is negative 6. When I add them together, I get a positive 1n. So it's going to be n plus 3 and n minus 2. Okay? We're on to our last one here. Z squared plus 2z minus 8. I know that I'm going to have two binomials that look like this. Z plus something, z minus something. I'm going to start going through my factor pairs, and keep in mind that the larger factor needs to be positive to get this positive middle term. So I'm going to have 8 times negative 1, which results in negative 8, but when I add those together I get 7. That's not going to work. Next one would be 4 times negative 2. When I multiply those together I get negative 8, and when I add those together I get positive 2z. So it's going to be z plus 4 and z minus 2. All right, so for today's homework, you have all 4 types that you're going to be factoring. Please reach out if you need any help. We're going to be practicing this skill for about a week, because this skill is so important to solving quadratics. Thank you.